We go to the wilderness to find silence. We go to escape the eyes of the city and the noise of the modern world. But there is a terrifying difference between being solitary and being isolated. Because when the sun goes down, the forest changes. The trees that offered shelter during the day become hiding spots at night. The silence you craved becomes deafening. And deep down, your primal instincts know the truth. Just because you can't see anyone doesn't mean you aren't being watched. Tonight, we are venturing into 4 true accounts of wilderness horror. From a glass cabin that turns into a lit-up stage for a stalker, to a solo kayaker who finds proof that his solo trip was anything but, and a veteran hunter who realized he had walked into a trap. If you are brave enough to be watching this video in the dark right now, hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. And to prove you're really watching with the lights off, I want you to leave a comment below with just one word: alone. Now, check your locks, draw your curtains, and listen close. Here are 4 reasons why you should never go into the woods by yourself. In 2014, 19-year-old Sarah, a college student, was totally thrilled because her uncle asked her to house sit his place in the Adirondacks for a week. This wasn't just some shack. It was this massive, beautiful A-frame cabin right on the edge of a private lake. It was the kind of place where you have no cell service, no internet, and the nearest neighbor is miles down a dirt road, which to her sounded like paradise because she just wanted to disconnect, read some books, and relax before finals started. So, to understand why this gets so scary, you have to picture the layout of this house. Like I said, it was an A-frame, which means the entire back wall facing the lake was basically just glass. It had these huge floor-to-ceiling windows that went all the way up to the peak of the roof. The ground floor was an open concept living room and kitchen, and then there was a spiral staircase leading up to a loft bedroom. The loft had a railing that looked down into the living room. So if you were in bed, you were looking right out those massive upper windows at the lake and the tree line. It was beautiful during the day, but at night, it turned into this giant black mirror where you couldn't see out, but anyone outside could definitely see in. The first couple of days were amazing. She spent her time hiking, swimming, and just enjoying the silence. But on the 4th day, a heavy storm rolled in, and the vibe changed completely. It got super dark early in the afternoon, and the rain was just pounding against the glass. She decided to just curl up on the couch downstairs and watch movies on her laptop. Around 10 p.m., the rain stops, but it's pitch black outside. She gets up to go to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and out of habit, she glances out the big glass doors toward the lake. Now, they had this long wooden dock that stretched out into the water, and they had solar lights on the posts. She looks out, and she freezes, because standing at the very end of the dock, illuminated by one of those weak little solar lights, is a person. She's thinking, okay, maybe it's a fisherman, maybe a neighbor got lost, but this person isn't moving. They are just standing there, facing the house, arms down by their sides, perfectly still. And she gets this pit in her stomach because it's 10 at night, miles from civilization. And this person is just staring at the cabin. She immediately runs around and checks all the locks. The front door, the sliding glass door, the side windows, everything is locked. She turns off all the lights inside so that maybe she can see out better without the reflection, and she creeps back to the window. The figure is gone. She scans the dock, the shoreline, the yard, nothing. She starts trying to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was a shadow or a trick of the light. She convinces herself she's just being paranoid. So she decides to go upstairs to the loft, get in bed, and just try to sleep it off. She climbs into bed, pulls the covers up, and she's facing those big upper windows. The way the bed is positioned, she has a direct line of sight to the tree line at the edge of the property. The moon had come out a little bit, so there was this faint blue light washing over the yard. As she's lying there, just staring out, She sees movement down by the wood line, probably about 50 yards from the house. She squints, and she sees a figure step out from behind a large pine tree. It's the same person. And they aren't just walking, they are moving in this really weird, jerky way. They take a few steps toward the house, then stop. Then a few more steps, and stop. She grabs her phone to call 911. But of course, looking at the screen, it says, no service. She's completely terrified now. She realizes she's trapped in this glass cage, and this person is coming for the house. She watches as the figure gets to the edge of the patio, right below the deck, and disappears from her view because of the angle of the roof. She can't see them anymore, but she knows they are right underneath her. She's holding her breath, listening. It's silent for a long time. And then, just like in the other story, she hears it. Not tapping, but a slow, deliberate, dragging sound on the glass downstairs. It sounded like someone ran their fingernails from one end of the sliding door to the other. Screech. She pulls the blankets over her head, shaking. Then she hears heavy footsteps on the wooden deck. Thump, thump, thump. They are walking around the perimeter of the house. She hears the doorknob to the back door jiggle violently, rattling the whole frame. Then silence again. She's lying there, praying they leave, when she hears a sound that makes her blood run cold. It's the sound of weight being put on the trellis that runs up the side of the house, right next to the chimney. It's this creaking, snapping sound of wood straining. Someone is climbing up. She's paralyzed. She watches the peak of the A-frame window, the highest point of the house, right near the ceiling of the loft. Suddenly, a hand slaps against the glass, way up high where no one should be able to reach. Then, another hand. Then, a face presses against the glass, illuminated by the moonlight. It was a man, but his face was pressed so hard against the glass that his features were distorted, mashed flat against the pane. He wasn't trying to break in, he was just looking. He hung there 20 feet off the ground, just staring at her in her bed with these wide, unblinking eyes. He stayed there for what felt like an hour, just watching her, while she was too terrified to even scream. Eventually, he slowly slid down out of view. She didn't sleep a wink. She stayed huddled in that corner until the sun came up. As soon as it was light out, she grabbed her car keys, ran downstairs, didn't even pack her bags, just bolted out the front door, got in her car, and sped away. When she got to the town, she called her uncle and told him something happened and she couldn't stay. Her uncle went up there the next day to check on the place. He called her back and said, "Sarah, I don't know what you saw, but you were right to leave." He told her that when he got there, he found footprints all over the deck, but that wasn't the worst part. He said the entire back wall of windows, from the bottom floor all the way to the peak of the roof, was covered in muddy handprints and face prints, smudged everywhere, as if someone had spent the entire night crawling all over the glass, watching her from every possible angle. She never went back to that cabin again. In 2010, the survival drama 127 Hours was released in theaters, telling the harrowing true story of Aaron Ralston, a climber who became trapped by a boulder in a remote canyon in Utah. The film highlighted the extreme dangers of solo exploration, but for a certain subset of outdoor enthusiasts, it didn't serve as a warning. Instead, it served as a challenge. It romanticized the idea of being completely alone, battling the elements, and relying solely on one's own wits to survive. One person who was totally captivated by this idea of radical self-reliance was a 24-year-old software engineer named Mark Davis. Mark lived in Seattle, Washington, and spent his days in a windowless office staring at code. He was burnt out, he was bored, and he was desperate for a reset. After watching 127 hours and reading countless blogs about extreme solo travel, Mark decided he didn't just want a vacation, he wanted an expedition. And so, without telling his coworkers or his worried mother the full extent of his plans, Mark spent thousands of dollars on top of the line gear, and mapped out a solo kayaking trip through the Boundary Waters on the border of Minnesota and Canada. The Boundary Waters is this massive labyrinth of over 1,000 lakes and streams that stretches for 1 million acres. It is true wilderness. There are no roads, no cell service, and if you get into trouble out there, you are completely on your own. But that is exactly what Mark wanted. He wanted the silence, and so in the summer of 2011, Mark flew to Minnesota, rented a truck, and drove north until the road literally ended. He loaded up his kayak, pushed off into the water, and began what was supposed to be a 10-day solo loop through some of the most isolated waterways in North America. For the first 3 days, the trip was absolute paradise. Mark would paddle for 8 hours a day, gliding across glass-like water, and then he'd find these tiny, uninhabited islands to camp on at night. He'd catch fish for dinner, read by a headlamp, and sleep better than he ever had in the city. The isolation wasn't scary, it was liberating. But on the afternoon of the 4th day, the vibe of the trip shifted. Mark was paddling through a very narrow, marshy channel that connected 2 large lakes. The reeds were high on both sides, creating this claustrophobic tunnel of vegetation. As Mark rounded a sharp bend in this channel, he suddenly had to back paddle hard to avoid colliding with another canoe that was just sitting there, motionless, in the water. Sitting in the canoe was a single figure wearing a bright yellow rain jacket with the hood pulled up tight, even though it was a sunny, cloudless day. Mark, feeling a burst of adrenaline from the near collision, laughed nervously and said, "Whoa, didn't see you there. Beautiful day, right?" The person in the yellow jacket didn't say a word. They just sat there, clutching their paddle across their lap, staring dead at Mark. Because of the hood and the angle of the sun, Mark couldn't make out the person's face. He could just feel their eyes on him. Mark waited a beat, expecting a nod or a wave, but the person remained statue still. And so, feeling creeped out and awkward, Mark just muttered, "Have a good one," and paddled around them. As Mark put distance between himself and the stranger, he couldn't resist the urge to look back. When he turned his head, he saw that the canoe had rotated. The person in the yellow jacket was no longer facing down the channel. They were facing Mark, watching him leave. Mark told himself, "Okay, that was weird, but it's public land. You get weirdos in the woods." He tried to shake it off, paddling an extra 5 miles that day just to put a massive gap between him and the silent canoeist. That night, Mark found a campsite on a small, rocky island in the middle of a massive lake. It was perfect. It offered a 360-degree view of the water, meaning no one could approach him without being seen. He set up his tent, ate his dinner, and eventually convinced himself that the encounter earlier was just a socially awkward fisherman. He hung his food bag high in a pine tree to keep it safe from bears, and he went to sleep. Sometime around 3 a.m., Mark woke up. He didn't know why, but he was instantly wide awake. The wind had died down, and the lake was dead silent. He lay there in his sleeping bag, straining his ears, and then he heard it. Splash. It was the distinct, rhythmic sound of a paddle dipping into the water, and it was close. Mark sat up and unzipped the mesh window of his tent. He peered out into the darkness, but the moon was behind the clouds, so he couldn't see anything, but he could hear it. The paddling sound was getting louder and closer. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by, they were heading straight for his island. Mark grabbed his bear spray and his flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. The paddling sound stopped abruptly, right at the rocky shore of his island, maybe 20 yards from his tent. Then, he heard the sound of a canoe hull scraping against rock. Someone had landed. Mark unzipped his tent door, jumped out, and blasted his high-powered flashlight toward the shore, screaming, "Who's there? I have a weapon!" The beam of light cut through the darkness and swept across the rocky shoreline. There was nothing there. No canoe, no person in a yellow jacket, just the empty rocks and the black water. Mark stood there for 10 minutes, shaking, scanning the lake, but it was completely empty. He eventually told himself that he must have been dreaming, or maybe it was a beaver slapping its tail on the water, and his brain had turned it into the sound of a paddle. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, Mark packed his camp in record time. He was exhausted and on edge, but he convinced himself that in the light of day, his fears were silly. He got back in his kayak and started paddling. The 5th day passed without incident. He didn't see a single soul. The vastness of the boundary waters began to calm him down again. By late afternoon, the sun was blazing, and Mark felt foolish for panicking the night before. He decided to set up camp early in a secluded bay that was miles off the main route. He wanted total privacy to finally relax. He pulled his kayak onto the shore, set up his tent, and walked into the woods to gather firewood. He was gone for maybe 15 minutes. When he walked back into his campsite, his blood ran cold. His kayak, which he had pulled completely out of the water and onto the grass, was gone. Mark dropped his firewood and ran to the water's edge. He scanned the lake, frantic, and then he saw it. About 200 yards out, drifting aimlessly in the middle of the bay, was his kayak, and floating right next to it was another canoe. It was the canoe with the person in the yellow jacket. They were just sitting there, holding onto Mark's kayak, staring back at the shore. Mark realized with horror that this person had been following him the entire time. They had tracked him across miles of open water, navigated through the same complex chain of lakes, and had waited until he walked into the woods to silently glide in and steal his only way out. Mark yelled at them, "Hey, bring that back! What are you doing?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, they simply let go of Mark's kayak, allowing it to drift freely in the wind, and then they began to paddle backward, fading into the glare of the setting sun, never taking their eyes off Mark. Mark was now stranded. The water was too cold to swim the 200 yards to retrieve his boat without risking hypothermia, but he had no choice. He stripped off his clothes and swam harder than he had ever swum in his life. He reached his kayak, scrambled inside, and paddled back to shore, shivering and terrified. He didn't even bother to pack his tent. He threw his essential gear into the kayak and paddled like a madman. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get to a ranger station. He paddled through the night, navigating by the stars, terrified that every splash of water behind him was the yellow jacket coming back to finish the job. Mark paddled for 18 straight hours until he finally reached a busy entry point where families were launching their boats. He collapsed on the dock and told the outfitters what had happened. They called the park rangers, who launched a search of the area where Mark had been. The rangers found Mark's abandoned tent and his camping gear right where he left it. But when they searched the surrounding waterways and questioned other campers, nobody had seen a lone canoeist in a yellow jacket. There were no permits issued to a solo traveler matching that description. It was as if the person didn't exist. However, a week later, a group of Boy Scouts camping on the island where Mark had stayed, on that terrifying 4th night, the night he heard the paddling, found something disturbing. Tucked deep inside a hollow log near the campsite, they found a disposable camera. When they developed the photos, most of them were blurry shots of the woods. But the last 3 photos on the roll were clear. They were photos of Mark. One was of Mark paddling his kayak from a distance. One was of Mark setting up his tent. And the final photo was taken at night through the mesh window of Mark's tent while he was asleep. The flash had been turned off, so Mark never woke up, but the image showed him sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the fact that someone was standing inches away from his face, watching him in the dark. To this day, they have never identified the person in the yellow jacket, and Mark has never gone into the woods alone again. In October of 1976, 3 seasoned land surveyors were dropped off by a float plane on the edge of a remote lake in the Alaskan interior, miles from the nearest settlement. These were tough, practical men who didn't scare easily. They were contracted to map out a section of dense forest for a future logging project, and they planned to stay for 2 weeks in an old trapper's cabin that had been abandoned years prior. For the first 2 days, everything went exactly according to plan. The work was hard, the terrain was brutal, but the men were making good progress. However, on the third afternoon, the mood shifted. One of the men, a guy named Miller, had hiked up a ridge to set a marker, while the other two, Davis and Jenkins, stayed near the creek bottom. When Miller came back down about 20 minutes later, he was pale and visibly shaken. He told the others that while he was up on the ridge, the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. He said he got that prickling feeling on the back of his neck, the kind that tells you you're being hunted. When he turned around to scan the tree line, he saw something massive, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the spruce trees. He said it looked like a man, but it was at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted fur. The moment Miller made eye contact with it, the thing dropped to all fours and scurried backward into the brush with impossible speed. Naturally, Davis and Jenkins were skeptical. They figured Miller had just seen a grizzly bear standing on its hind legs, and that his imagination was getting the better of him. They laughed it off. But Miller insisted on keeping his high-powered rifle loaded and close by for the rest of the day. As dusk began to settle over the valley, the men retreated to the cabin. It was a solid structure, built from heavy logs with a thick wooden door, but it had seen better days. There was only one small window, facing the lake, and the glass was long gone, replaced by a heavy wooden shutter that could be barred from the inside. They got a fire going in the wood stove and were trying to relax, but the atmosphere was tense. Miller wouldn't sit down. He kept pacing and listening. Around 10 p.m., just as they were thinking about turning in, they heard a heavy, wet thump against the side of the cabin. It sounded like someone had slapped the logs with a massive side of beef. The men froze. Davis grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the crack under the door, while Jenkins picked up the only other firearm. They had a large caliber revolver. Silence followed for about a minute, and then the cabin shuddered. Something incredibly heavy had slammed its shoulder against the back wall, shaking the dust from the rafters. This wasn't a bear rubbing against the wood. This was a calculated shove. Then the vocalization started. It was a strange, guttural, chattering sound, almost like a language, coming from right outside the shuttered window. And then a second voice answered from the other side of the cabin. The men realized with horror that they were surrounded. Suddenly, a massive hand with thick, dark fingers tried to pry the wooden shutter open. The nails were long and black, digging into the aged wood with terrifying strength. Jenkins didn't hesitate. He fired a shot right through the center of the shutter. A deafening, enraged roar erupted from outside, a sound so loud it vibrated in their chests. They heard heavy footsteps pounding away from the window, but the creatures didn't leave. For the next 4 hours, the cabin was under siege. The creatures began tearing huge chunks of moss and clay, chinking from between the logs, trying to create gaps to see inside. The men were scrambling, pushing a beef for time, heavy oak table against the door and using their bodies to brace the walls where the chinking was being ripped out. At one point, something climbed onto the roof. They could hear the heavy, deliberate steps pacing back and forth above their heads, followed by the sound of the chimney pipe being rattled, as if the thing was trying to tear it right out of the roof to gain entry. The surveyor sat back to back in the center of the room, weapons trained on the door and window, listening to the nightmare outside. Every time they thought it was over, a rock would smash against the clivens, door, or a heavy log would be thrown against the wall, just to let them know the creatures were still there, waiting. Finally, just before dawn, the forest went quiet. The scratching on the roof stopped, and the heavy breathing at the door faded away. The men didn't move until the sun was fully up and shining through the baka cracks in the walls. When they finally worked up the courage to unbar the door and step outside, the campsite was destroyed. Their equipment was smashed, their fire pit had been stomped out, and deep claw marks gouged the solid wood of the campsite door frame. But the most chilling part was the footprints. The mud around the cabin was churned up with massive barefoot prints, some measuring over 18 inches long. They didn't wait for the 2 weeks to be up. They gathered what little gear was salvageable, hiked frantically to the pickup point, and radioed the pilot to come get them immediately. When they got back to civilization, they filed a report claiming aggressive bear activity. But amongst themselves, they knew exactly what had been out there in the dark. They never went back to that valley again. In April of 1998, David Lang drifted into the Ozarks National Forest in Arkansas for the opening weekend of turkey season. David was a veteran hunter. He knew these woods like the back of his hand, and he had a specific ridge in mind that was about 3 miles deep into the public land. It was rugged terrain, steep and full of ravines, which meant most casual hunters wouldn't bother hiking out there. He parked his truck well before sunrise and hiked in by flashlight. By the time the sun started to crest over the hills, David was set up at the base of a massive oak tree, fully camouflaged, waiting for the turkeys to start gobbling from their roosts. He sat there for about an hour, calling periodically, but the woods were dead silent. Usually, in the spring, the forest is alive with birds and squirrels, but on this morning, it was eerie. There was nothing. Around 7 a.m., David heard something coming through the brush to his left. He raised his shotgun, thinking a gobbler was sneaking in silently. But instead of a turkey, a coyote burst out of the thicket. Now, coyotes are usually skittish and will bolt the second they smell or see a human, but this coyote ran within 5 feet of David's boot. It didn't even look at him. It was panting, ears pinned back, running full tilt like it was terrified of something behind it. David watched the coyote disappear over the ridge, and he started to get this sinking feeling in his gut. He realized that whatever scared a predator like that had to be significant. He slowly turned his head back toward the thicket where the coyote had come from. About 70 yards away, standing in a patch of shadows near a creek bed, David saw what looked like a man standing perfectly still. David was instantly annoyed. He thought another hunter had snuck in on him and was ruining his hunt. He stood up and waved his hand, basically doing the universal "I'm here, don't shoot" signal, expecting the guy to wave back or turn around and leave. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, blending in with the tree trunks. David grabbed his binoculars to get a better look, thinking maybe it was a game warden. As soon as he focused the lenses, the blood drained from his face. He realized he wasn't looking at camouflage clothing. He was looking at dark, matted hair. The creature was standing next to a sapling, and its hand was resting on the trunk, about 7 feet off the ground. It had massive shoulders, no neck to speak of, and a face that David described as looking like an old, angry man, but with dark skin and wide-set eyes. David froze. He lowered the binoculars, his brain trying to process that he was looking at a monster. Suddenly, the creature slapped the tree trunk. Whack. It sounded like a baseball bat hitting a telephone pole. Immediately, from the ridge directly behind David, probably only 40 yards away, something else slapped a tree. Whack. David spun around, terrified, realizing he had been flanked. He couldn't see the second one through the dense brush, but he could hear it breathing. It was a heavy, raspy, wet sound. They weren't just wandering past him, they had positioned themselves around him. The creature in front of him let out a low, guttural grunt, not a roar, but a deep vibration that David said he could feel in his chest. It took a step forward. It wasn't charging, but it was closing the distance. David didn't wait to see what happened next. He didn't run, because he knew that might trigger a chase response, so he started walking backward, keeping his gun raised, moving toward the logging trail that led back to his truck. As he backed away, he could hear the crunching of leaves on both sides of him. They were escorting him out. Every time David stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped. Every time he started walking, the footsteps started again, paralleling him through the timber. This went on for nearly 2 miles. They never attacked, and they never showed themselves fully again, but they stayed right on his perimeter, making sure he kept moving. When David finally burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel road where his truck was parked, he scrambled inside, locked the doors, and threw it into reverse. As he was backing out, he looked up at the embankment where the forest met the road. He saw two dark shapes standing just inside the tree line, watching him drive away. David drove straight home, sold his turkey hunting gear, and never went back to that part of the Ozarks again. He was convinced that the only reason he made it out that day was because he left immediately. If he had stayed or tried to shoot, he believed they would have killed him. From the glass walls of the Adirondacks to the silent waterways of Minnesota, these stories prove that total isolation might be a myth. We go into the wilderness to get away from people, but as we learn today, we aren't always the only ones out there. Which of these 4 stories unsettled you the most? Was it the realization that Mark was being photographed while he slept, or the terror of being flanked in the Ozarks? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed these disturbing wilderness tales, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more nightmare fuel. And finally, if you have a terrifying story of your own, whether it happened deep in the woods or in your own backyard, I want to hear it. Send your story to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there, and maybe keep your curtains closed tonight.